Assalamualaikum students, welcome to the class. Today again it will be my combined class for both 11th and 12th and our topic is relative clauses. So first, do you know what clauses are? Basically, if you put a bunch of words together and it sounds like a sentence on its own, then it is a clause. So here a question arises, is a clause and a sentence a same thing? A clause by itself can be a sentence, but you can also put two or more clauses together into one large sentence, like you see in the visual. So in fact, one way to do that is with relative clauses. Okay, now why is it called the relative clause? Because one clause is related to other, kind of like in a family. Yes, you and your cousin have grandparents in common, so you are related to your cousin. In the same way, relative clause has a word or phrase in common with the main clause of its sentence. Okay, so I'll give you an example. I got tickets to see Vanessa Jones, who sings like an angel. So we have got two clauses here. What's the first one? I got tickets to see Vanessa Jones, and who sings like an angel is the other clause. But both clauses talk about of Vanessa Jones. Okay, so they have that in common. But who sings like an angel can't be a sentence in itself. Well, I guess it could be if it was a question. Okay, who is a pronoun, kind of like we, him, he, or this. And who is also a relative pronoun which we use for questions and for relative clauses. So what are the common question words? Do you know? Yes, who, what, where, and when. Okay, now this was the quick note for relative clauses. We need to change what to which. What to which. But what about this clause? Like I said, who is a pronoun. So let's replace it with another pronoun. She sings like an angel. Yeah, that could be a sentence, but by itself. Or we could replace the pronouns by noun they represent. For example, Vanessa Jones sings like an angel. So we have two good clauses here, each in their own sentence. I got tickets to see Vanessa Jones. Vanessa Jones sings like an angel. Or we could put them together into one sentence, like for example, as you can see in the visual, I got tickets to see Vanessa Jones, who sings like an angel. So let's take a look how we put these clauses together. We'll use a different pair. For example, we watched Toy Story at Dave's house last night. Toy Story was the first Pixar film. Are these two sentences related? Yes, they are talking about Toy Story. Our first step in putting the clauses together is to find out the noun they have in common. Let's recall it star, as I have put in the visual, instead of the noun. Okay, so the both clauses have in common every time. Works for me. Now the next step is to decide which is your main clause and which is your relative clause. Sometimes it doesn't really matter, but often the main clause should fit better with the context. So are we talking about what you did last night, or are we talking about Pixar? So does that mean a relative clause is less important than a main clause? Kind of. The relative clause usually gives us more information about something in the main clause, but sometimes sentence sounds better or worse depending on which clause is relative. So why don't we try both ways and see how they sound? Alright, so let's say Toy Story was the first Pixar film is a relative clause. Alright, put it after the star in the main clause, but remember Toy Story is in the middle of the sentence. So if we put the relative clause there, it's inside the main clause. That's fine. To remove the star from the relative clause, we'll replace it with a relative pronoun. So this means if we have to remove star from the relative clause, we'll replace it with relative pronoun. So that's step 4. What's the best pronoun for star Toy Story? Is a movie. It's a movie, and we should use which for things like that. Good. Place it in at the beginning of the green clause, and that's also what will be our final sentence. So it will be like we watched Toy Story, which was the first Pixar film, at Dave's house last night. Okay, did you notice I paused before and after the relative clause? It's because when we write them down, we put commas in those places, as you can see in the visual. So I hope you got it. Now let's go back to step 2 and we'll make the opposite choice. The top clause is the relative one. Now, and what do we do with it? So as you can see in the visual, what do we do with it? We put it after the Toy Story in the bottom clause, but before what's the first Pixar film, right? Now we remove the star from the green clause. As you can see in the visual, there will be no confusion for you. And then we add who, which, were, or when. We add which just like last time and put it before we washed. Alright, so we are done. So our sentences be like Toy Story, which we watched at Dave's house last night, was the first Pixar film, which is from the right corner. So both the sentences sounded good. So I guess this depends on the context this time. Okay, but if it doesn't sound correct for some other clauses you're working on, try changing. Which clause is the relative one? Now the question arises, what happens if I put the relative clause in the wrong spot? Didn't we get a misplaced modifier, which means you are giving information about the wrong thing? So let's try this example. My friend Greg has a pet rabbit who is 6 feet tall. So the relative clause should come just after the star, or what two clauses have in common. So here it looked like both clauses are talking about the rabbit. The rabbit is 6 feet tall. But does that sound right to you? The answer is no. Then who is 6 feet tall? Actually, it's my friend Greg. Then it will go like this. My friend Greg, who is 6 feet tall, has a pet rabbit. So now there is another relative pronoun which we use with possessives. If we are talking about like Steve in the main clause, but Steve's hat in the relative clause will say whose hat. One more thing, we have talked about the common link between the clauses being nouns, but they can also be verb phrases, like with this example. Penny always picks her nose, which is really gross. In this example, what does which refer to? Her nose? Is her nose really gross? No. Then what is probably very gross? Picking her nose. Yes, it's not just one thing, it's the whole situation, correct? So when a relative clause refers to a situation, we use which as a pronoun usually. So when do we use relative clauses? Whenever you want to put together in one sentences, like I said before, the relative clauses usually give us more information about something in the main clause. Relative clause like you express all that once. Another reason is to change the flow of the paragraph. If you have a bunch of short sentences in a paragraph and it sounds very choppy, so there is a lot of styling and it helps to put some of the sentences together. This can give you some variation and rhythm. So when your words flow together more, you sound more natural. And if you want to write or sound smoother, consider using relative clauses. So I hope this whole idea and this whole chapter of relative clauses is quite clear to you. So if you have any questions related to the topic, you can drop your posts in the comment section. See you in the next class. Till then, Allah Hafiz.